His story is called Screaming Well. There were certain places in Dalton, Connecticut that the locals simply avoided. The old Mason farm out on the edge of town was one of them, and for good reason. Even at a distance, the place had an oppressive air, a heaviness that seemed to thicken with each step closer. Like the ground itself, resisted anyone who dared come near. Over the years, folks learned to stay away, except for teenagers with something to prove, or curious souls who didn't know better, and sometimes they didn't come back. But that didn't stop Caroline from driving up there one frigid October night. The Mason property had been in her family for generations, but it was no place to take pride in. The stories alone were enough to chill her blood. Tales of people disappearing, of strange sounds in the dead of night, of a presence, something in the fields, the woods, or maybe in the well out back. Caroline's grandmother, Nana Ruth, used to tell her not to go near that well, no matter what. Some things are buried for good reason, she'd say, her pale blue eyes hard and set. That well's the worst of them. It'll reach up and take you if you let it. But Caroline had always been the type to question things, even the strange, creepy tales Nana Ruth would spin on quiet, rainy nights. And now that Nana Ruth was gone, and Caroline had inherited the property, curiosity had gotten the better of her. She'd felt drawn to the house, to the well. The secrets it held pulled at her in a way she couldn't ignore. The house loomed like a skeleton, its wooden slats sagging and creaking in the wind. Caroline parked her car a few feet away and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The air was colder here, sharp and biting, smelling faintly of rot and something older, a musty, earthy smell that clung to the inside of her nose. The front door creaked as she opened it, and she was met by a waft of cold, stale air that prickled her skin. The inside was just as she remembered from childhood visits: dust, broken furniture, and a silence so deep it felt almost alive. As she made her way through the dim, crumbling rooms, her flashlight's beam flickered over faded family photos, furniture draped in tattered sheets, and walls lined with peeling wallpaper. Memories of Nana Ruth came back to her, the old woman's stern voice warning her about the well. It was the well that Caroline came here for. She could feel it like a heartbeat in the walls, a magnetic pull guiding her to the back of the property. She stepped out onto the back porch, her flashlight casting a narrow path across the overgrown grass and weeds. The well stood at the far end of the yard, just a low, circular stone structure, worn and cracked, with an old wooden bucket dangling on a rope, swaying slightly in the wind. The sight of it sent a shiver down her spine. Caroline took a few hesitant steps forward, then stopped, trying to listen. There was something strange in the air, a low, almost imperceptible hum. It seemed to vibrate in her bones, pressing into her, whispering. It was coming from the well. A memory surfaced, sharp and sudden, Nana Ruth's voice talking about the screams. Caroline had always thought it just a spooky story, a scare tactic. But now, standing here, she wondered if there was more to it. She took another step, and the hum grew louder, morphing into something like a distant moan. She could feel it vibrating, up from the stones, up through her boots. Curiosity burned in her. She leaned over the edge, her flashlight's beam cutting down into the blackness, illuminating the slick, moss-covered stones that lined the walls. The well was deep, far deeper than it had any right to be. The light barely reached 10 feet before it disappeared into pure darkness. And then, as if from nowhere, a whisper drifted up from the depths. Caroline. She jerked back, heart pounding. The voice was faint, so soft she could have dismissed it as the wind. But there was something about it, a familiarity that dug into her mind and rooted there. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky, feeling foolish for speaking to an empty well. The silence stretched, and then came the whisper again, clearer this time. "Caroline." Her hands were trembling, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. She peered down again, feeling the darkness reach up for her like it was alive, breathing, waiting. And then the voice came again, louder, and this time it sounded exactly like her grandmother's. "Come closer, Caroline." Her mouth went dry, but she was rooted in place, unable to tear herself away. She gripped the edge of the well, knuckles white, and leaned forward just a bit more. "Help me," the voice moaned. It was unmistakably Nana Ruth. But how could that be? Nana Ruth had been buried in the churchyard, nearly 100 miles away. And yet, here she was, her voice, her tone, echoing from the darkness. "Help me." Caroline's head swam with questions, with disbelief. But then she saw something, just a glimpse, at the very edge of her flashlight's reach, something pale, like a hand, pressing against the stone wall, struggling as if it were clawing its way up from the bottom. The air grew colder, and the humming grew louder, thrumming through her body, pressing into her bones. "Caroline," it whispered, closer now, almost pleading, "you have to help me." And before she could stop herself, she was lowering the bucket, hands shaking as she gripped the rope. Her mind screamed that this was impossible, that she was imagining things, but something compelled her, something beyond rational thought, something that felt like fate. The rope descended into the darkness, deeper and deeper, until it seemed to go taut, as if it had caught on something. Caroline took a deep breath and began to pull, grunting with the effort as she heaved the bucket upward. With each pull, the air grew colder, thick with an icy mist that seeped up from the well, swirling around her like tendrils. She ignored it, focusing on the weight in her hands, on the feeling that something was moving up toward her, something that felt all too alive. When the bucket finally crested to the top of the well, she stepped back, staring at what she'd pulled up. It was a doll, old and worn, its face cracked and yellowed with age, one glass eye missing, leaving an empty, dark socket. Her heart lurched, memories rushing back. This was her doll, the one she'd lost here as a child. She remembered crying for days, begging her mother to help her find it, but it had simply vanished, swallowed up by the yard or the house or something else. She felt a surge of nausea, of dread, staring at the familiar broken face. The doll's remaining eyes seemed to glint, catching the flashlight's beam as if looking straight at her. And then it blinked. She dropped the bucket, heart hammering, and stumbled back, tripping over her own feet and landing hard on the cold, damp ground. The whispering grew louder, and as she scrambled to her feet, she felt something grab her ankle. A hand, cold and slick like moss-covered stone, gripping tight. She looked down, and there it was, a withered, skeletal hand jutting from the ground, clamping down on her ankle with impossible strength. She screamed, kicking at it, but the hand only tightened its grip, pulling her down inch by inch towards the well. "No!" she shrieked, thrashing, clawing at the grass. But more hands appeared, crawling up from the earth, her fingers digging into her skin, pulling her toward the dark, gaping maw of the well. "Help me, Caroline." The voice was louder now, filling the air around her, and she realized with horror that it was all of them, a chorus of voices rising from the well, a cacophony of pleading, screaming, crying voices, each one a twisted echo of someone who had come here and never left. She clawed and fought, but the hands were relentless, dragging her inch by inch toward the well's edge. She could see faces now, twisted and contorted, rising from the shadows, their hollow eyes, their mouths stretched wide in endless, silent screams. "Join us," they whispered, pulling her closer, their voices filling her mind, drowning her thoughts. With a final, desperate scream, Caroline lunged forward, wrenching her foot free and stumbling back. She staggered to her feet and ran, heart pounding, her mind reeling with the sight of those hands. those faces reaching up from the earth. As she reached the edge of the property, she dared to glance back. The well stood silent, dark, as if nothing had happened, but she knew better. The voices still echoed in her ears, a haunting, endless litany that would follow her wherever she went. "Come back," they whispered, just below the edge of hearing. "Come back to us." As she fled, she knew she'd never be able to escape them, not fully, because some things, once they touch you, never let go.